There was a time when attention did not have to choose. Nothing competed for it. No written words, no distant voices, no images asking to be remembered. The world did not request constant response. Sound was limited. Movement was slow. Change arrived gradually. In such a world, attention behaved differently. It did not jump. It did not scan. It stayed. Not because it was trained to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The human mind did not yet move outward endlessly. It remained close to the body, close to the ground, close to repetition. In this environment, focus did not feel like effort. It felt natural. When people gathered, they did not arrive with information. They arrived with bodies. Bodies that recognized familiar conditions. Familiar light, familiar silence, familiar spacing between one another. Attention followed what remained constant. It rested on what did not change quickly. Stone, fire, shadow. These elements did not distract. They stabilized. Nothing pulled the mind forward. Nothing demanded interpretation. There was no pressure to understand what was happening, only to remain present within it. This presence did not require intention. It emerged when nothing else interfered. Over time, attention began to gather around certain places, not because they explained the world, but because they held it still. Some spaces did not invite movement. They slowed it. They did not offer meaning. They offered containment. In these spaces, the mind did not search. It waited, not for answers, but for nothing in particular. This waiting was not boredom. It was alignment. When attention settles without effort, the body softens, breath deepens, posture loosens. Awareness narrows gently, not through control, but through lack of disturbance. This state came long before belief, long before explanation. It did not belong to religion. It did not belong to myth. It belonged to conditions, to silence, to repetition, to the absence of urgency. Much later, these places would be named. They would be studied, measured, explained. But before all of that, they were simply locations where attention could remain undivided. This video is not about solving a site. It is not about decoding symbols or assigning purpose. It is about a moment in human history when attention first stayed in one place for a long time, when nothing asked it to move, and how that state still feels familiar to the modern mind when everything else finally becomes quiet. Before attention became something that could be stolen, interrupted, or fragmented, it moved slowly through the world. It was not pulled in many directions at once. It followed what was present, and nothing more. In early human environments, there were very few signals asking for focus at the same time. Sound came from a single source. Light came from the sky, the fire, or the moon. Movement was rare and meaningful. Because of this, attention did not need to choose. It responded. When something changed in the environment, it mattered. When nothing changed, the mind rested. There were no layers of stimulation competing for awareness. No background noise designed to be ignored. No constant low-level demand for response. This absence shaped the way perception worked. The eyes were not trained to scan endlessly. The ears were not filtering dozens of simultaneous sounds. The nervous system was not holding itself in a state of constant readiness. Instead, attention expanded outward, then returned inward, naturally, without instruction. Periods of focus were followed by long stretches of calm, watching the fire, listening to wind move through grass, observing shadows lengthen and disappear. Nothing demanded urgency. This does not mean life was simple or safe. It means that danger was intermittent, not continuous. When threat appeared, attention sharpened briefly and then released. The rest of the time, awareness remained broad and unforced. Modern environments train attention to remain alert, even when nothing is happening. Early environments allowed attention to relax when no response was required. This difference matters. Without competing signals, the mind did not fragment itself across multiple inputs. It stayed whole. It stayed present. Attention was not something to be protected. It was not something to be optimized. It was simply the way the body stayed in contact with its surroundings. As evening approached, this quality deepened. With fewer visual details and softer sounds, attention narrowed gently, not toward thought, but toward sensation, warmth, proximity, stillness. In such a world, awareness did not exhaust itself by constant redirection. It followed the rhythm of the environment and rested when the environment rested. This was a condition where focus did not require effort, because nothing was trying to pull it away. In a world before constant activity, silence was not an absence. It was the default state. There were moments of sound, footsteps on dry ground, voices near the fire, animals moving in the distance. But these moments did not overlap endlessly. They arrived, passed, and left space behind them. Silence did not signal danger. It did not suggest emptiness. It suggested continuity. For early humans, silence was familiar. It was what surrounded most actions, not what followed them. When the wind stopped, nothing replaced it. When conversation ended, the air did not fill itself with noise. The body adjusted naturally to this quiet, without interpreting it as something to escape. This shaped emotional response. Without constant sound, the nervous system learned when to relax. Without persistent stimulation, the mind did not search for distraction. Silence allowed attention to widen rather than tighten. At night, this effect deepened. Darkness reduced visual detail. Distance softened sound. The environment itself slowed perception. In such conditions, silence created orientation rather than uncertainty. It helped people sense where they were, who was near, and what mattered. Modern minds often associate silence with discomfort, something to be filled or corrected. But this association is learned. It does not belong to the earlier human rhythm. In early environments, silence did not isolate the individual. It connected them more closely to subtle changes, temperature shifts, distant movement, the presence of others nearby. Because sound was rare, it carried meaning. Because silence was common, it carried safety. This balance prevented overstimulation. There was no need to protect oneself from noise, no need to manage sensory input. The world itself regulated intensity. Silence also allowed repetition to settle into the body. The same evening routines, the same gestures, the same pauses between actions. These patterns did not need explanation. They stabilized awareness simply by being repeated in quiet surroundings. In this way, silence became a condition that supported mental continuity. Thought did not rush to fill gaps. The mind did not narrate constantly. Instead, awareness stayed grounded in sensation and presence. This was not a cultivated practice. It was not intentional stillness. It was what happened when the world did not demand otherwise. Before symbols carried meaning, before words explained experience, the body was the first point of reference. It did not interpret the world. It responded to it. In early human life, there was no external system to organize time, identity, or purpose. The body provided this structure quietly. Movement marked the day. Rest marked the night. Hunger, warmth, fatigue, and relief created a rhythm that required no explanation. Without written instruction, memory lived in muscle and posture. The way people sat near the fire, the way they rose at dawn, the way paths were walked again and again until they became familiar. These movements were not conscious habits. They were anchors. The body remembered where to stand, when to slow, when to gather closer. This memory did not need reflection. It operated beneath thought. Breathing adjusted to temperature, steps adjusted to terrain, hands learned stone, wood, and hide through repetition. Knowledge entered through contact, not description. Because of this, the body held authority. It signaled when to stop. It signaled when to continue. It signaled when rest was needed. There was no expectation to override these signals. No system that demanded productivity beyond capacity. Modern life often separates the body from decision-making. Early life depended on it. This created a form of grounded awareness. Thought did not drift far from sensation. Attention stayed close to physical presence. At night, this connection strengthened. Darkness reduced visual cues. Sound softened. The body became the primary compass. Warmth from fire, proximity of others, pressure of the ground beneath the body. These sensations oriented awareness without effort. In such conditions, the body did not carry tension as a baseline. Alertness appeared only when necessary and dissolved when no longer needed. This is not a romantic image of simplicity. It is a description of function. The body was not subordinate to thought. It was the foundation beneath it. Only later would language, symbols, and explanation begin to replace this anchoring role. Here, in this earlier state, the body remained the quiet center of orientation. Before actions were performed to achieve results, many movements were repeated simply because they had been repeated before. They did not point toward a goal. They maintained balance. In early human environments, repetition was not evaluated. It was not questioned. It did not require justification. Certain gestures occurred each evening near the fire. Certain paths were walked in the same way. Certain objects were placed, adjusted, and returned without explanation. These actions were not symbolic in the modern sense. They did not represent ideas. They stabilized experience. Repetition created familiarity in a world that could otherwise feel uncertain. By repeating what was already known, the body reduced the need for constant adaptation. This is different from habit as we understand it today. There was no expectation of efficiency, no sense of improvement. The value of repetition was not outcome, it was continuity. When a movement is repeated without pressure, it loses urgency. When urgency disappears, tension follows. Near the fire, the same actions softened the nervous system. Hands moved slowly. Postures settled. Nothing needed to be completed. Modern thought often assumes that repetition must serve a purpose. In early contexts, repetition served presence. It allowed attention to remain anchored without effort. It kept awareness from drifting into anticipation or memory. There was no reason to ask why a gesture existed. Its existence was sufficient. Over time, these repeated actions formed a shared rhythm, not a rule, not a command, a pattern. This pattern did not instruct, it reassured. Because repetition was not tied to meaning, it remained flexible. It could adjust with environment, with season, with group size. There was no failure in repeating incorrectly. There was no correct form to preserve. Repetition here was not ritual yet. It was pre-ritual, a way of occupying time without dividing it, a way of moving without interpreting movement. Only later would repetition be assigned explanation. Later still, it would be named, categorized, and codified. Here, it remained quiet. And in that quiet repetition, the body learned to stay where it was, without seeking purpose, without demanding understanding. Before attention was trained, corrected, or guarded, it moved naturally within its surroundings. It did not jump rapidly from one focus to another. It rested where the environment placed it. In early human life, there were few competing points of interest. Light came from a single source. Sound arrived clearly, then faded. Movement was rare and meaningful. Because of this, attention did not need instruction. It followed presence. When something changed, awareness responded. When nothing changed, it remained still. There was no expectation to remain alert beyond necessity. No requirement to maintain focus when the moment did not ask for it. Modern minds often imagine early humans as constantly watchful, scanning for danger. This image misunderstands rhythm. Threat was occasional, not continuous. Most of life unfolded slowly. Between moments of action were long intervals of quiet continuity. In those intervals, attention softened. There was nothing attempting to capture it. No layered signals competing for response. No demand to prioritize one input over another. When attention was not engaged externally, it returned inward, to breath, to posture, to warmth and proximity. This created a state of awareness that did not exhaust itself. It did not need recovery from constant stimulation. At night, this condition deepened. Darkness simplified perception. Silence removed urgency. Attention narrowed gently, not toward thought, but toward presence. This was not concentration. It was not effort. It was the absence of redirection. Without instruction, awareness stayed whole. Without interruption, it remained stable. Only later would attention become something to be managed, something to be trained, something to be protected from loss. Here, in this earlier condition, attention did not need direction. It simply stayed where it was. Before places were defined by purpose, some locations simply began to receive attention, not because they offered shelter or resources or safety, but because people returned to them. In early human life, movement was constant. Groups followed seasons, animals, and water. Staying was rare. Returning was more unusual still. To come back to the same place meant something subtle had already shifted. There was no declaration that a location mattered, no marker that said this ground was different. The difference emerged quietly, through repetition. People arrived. They left. They returned. Each return reduced uncertainty. Each return made the space more familiar, without requiring explanation. The ground did not change, but attention did. Over time, familiarity created stability, not permanence, but recognition. This place became one that did not need to be reassessed each time it was entered. The body already knew how to move there. The eyes already knew where to rest. Returning did not mean settling. There were no structures designed for living, no signs of ownership. The value of the place was not in what it provided, but in what it allowed. It allowed attention to remain still. In a world defined by movement, returning to the same location softened the need to orient constantly. The mind did not need to map new terrain. The body did not need to adapt immediately. This created a pause in cognitive effort. The place held familiarity without demanding interpretation. It was not sacred, it was not symbolic. It was simply known. Modern thinking often looks for reasons. Why this hill? Why this clearing? But early repetition did not require justification. The act of returning was enough. By coming back, people reduced the number of decisions required. They reduced the need to choose. The place became a point of rest for attention, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. Over time, consistency becomes calming, not through explanation, but through absence of novelty. This is how a location begins to matter before meaning arrives, not through belief, not through intention, but through quiet return. Before actions were evaluated for efficiency or outcome, movement repeated itself naturally, not because it achieved something new, but because it maintained something steady. In early human life, movement was closely tied to environment. Hands adjusted stone. Bodies shifted closer to warmth. Feet followed familiar paths across the ground. When the same movement was repeated, it did not signal habit in the modern sense. It signaled orientation. Repeating a movement reduced uncertainty. The body no longer needed to calculate each action. It already knew how far to reach, how to turn, how to pause. This allowed attention to soften. There was no pressure to perform differently each time. No expectation of improvement. No sense that repetition was wasteful. Movement existed to keep the body aligned with its surroundings. Near the same place, the same gestures returned. Hands arranging objects, bodies sitting in similar positions, steps forming shallow paths over time. These actions were not symbolic. They were practical in the simplest sense. They made presence easier. Repetition lowered cognitive effort. When the body knows what comes next, the mind does not need to rush ahead. This created a rhythm without counting. No beginning, no end. Just movement, followed by stillness, followed by movement again. Modern life often treats repeated movement as mechanical or dull. Early repetition did the opposite. It grounded attention. The body did not move to express meaning. It moved to remain balanced. There was no distinction between functional action and calming action. They were the same. Over time, repeated movement created continuity across visits. A gesture performed today resembled one performed before, not because it was remembered consciously, but because the body recognized the setting. This recognition did not need language. When movements repeat in the same place, they quietly anchor awareness. They prevent the mind from drifting too far forward or backward. They keep attention where the body already is. This is how repetition begins to shape experience before meaning appears, not as ritual, not as belief, but as a way of staying present, again and again and again. Before explanation became necessary, action did not pause to justify itself. There was no requirement to assign meaning to what was being done. In early human contexts, the question why did not guide behavior, not because people lacked curiosity, but because explanation was not yet a condition for order. Actions occurred because they had occurred before. Movements were repeated because they were familiar. The body did not wait for reasoning to proceed. This absence of why created a different relationship with time. There was no anticipation of outcome, no expectation that an action should lead somewhere else. Doing was enough. When movements are not evaluated, they do not carry pressure. They do not need to prove value. They do not need to be improved or corrected. This allowed experience to remain simple, but not shallow. Without the question of why, attention stayed with what was happening, not with what it was supposed to represent. Modern thinking often assumes that meaning precedes action. Early repetition suggests the opposite. Action came first, meaning, if it arrived at all, came later. In the absence of explanation, there was no urgency to interpret, no demand to articulate purpose. This does not imply a lack of thought. It implies a different order. Thought followed experience, rather than directing it. When the body performs a familiar movement without explanation, the mind remains quiet. There is no internal dialogue asking if the action is correct. This quietness is important. It prevents the layering of tension that comes from constant evaluation. It allows continuity to remain unbroken. The absence of why also prevented division. There was no separation between those who understood and those who did not. No hierarchy of interpretation. Everyone participated in the same actions, in the same way. This created shared stability without instruction. Only later would explanation become necessary, to preserve, to teach, to justify. Here, before that shift, repetition did not require language. It simply required continuation. And in that continuation, the mind did not search for meaning. It remained where the body already was. Before habit became something automatic or mechanical, it functioned as a form of order. Not an imposed structure, but a stabilizing one. In early human life, habit did not exist to save time or effort. It existed to reduce disruption. When the same actions occurred in the same way, the world became predictable enough to rest within. This predictability was not rigid. It did not resist change. It simply did not rush toward it. Habit, in this sense, was not routine. Routine implies repetition for efficiency. Habit here implied repetition for balance. There was no schedule to follow, no expectation to perform at a certain pace. Actions repeated because they fit naturally into the rhythm of the day. This created order without instruction. The body knew when to slow, it knew when to stop, it knew when to resume movement. Habit allowed these transitions to happen smoothly, without conscious decision. Modern routines often feel draining because they are layered with obligation. Early habit carried no such weight. There was no internal pressure to keep up, no sense of falling behind. Habit did not trap attention, it freed it. When actions repeat reliably, the mind no longer needs to monitor them closely. It does not need to check for correctness or completion. This allowed awareness to remain soft and wide. Habit did not compress time. It expanded it. Moments were not rushed toward an outcome. They were allowed to unfold at their own pace. This kind of order did not rely on rules or enforcement. It emerged naturally from repetition that felt appropriate to the body. Because of this, habit remained flexible. If conditions changed, the habit changed with them. Nothing needed to be preserved exactly. Order here was not something to protect. It was something that adapted quietly. In this way, habit supported continuity without control. It held experience together without demanding attention. And because it did not require constant supervision, it allowed the mind to remain at ease. present, unforced, undivided. Before stability had to be justified, it simply existed. It was not something to defend or explain. It was something that held. In early human experience, stability did not come from rules or boundaries. It came from continuity. The same place, the same movements, the same intervals of gathering and leaving. None of this required interpretation. There was no story explaining why things were done in a certain way. No narrative preserving the order of events. The stability came from repetition itself. This allowed life to feel coherent without being articulated. Modern systems rely on explanation to maintain order. Early stability relied on familiarity. When actions unfold in expected ways, the nervous system relaxes. It does not search for threat or inconsistency. This relaxation does not require understanding. The body responds to regularity before the mind assigns meaning to it. Stability without explanation also prevented overthinking. There was no internal pressure to analyze patterns, no concern that things needed to be justified. This kept experience grounded in the present. The absence of explanation did not weaken stability, it strengthened it. Because nothing depended on belief or interpretation, stability was not fragile. It did not collapse when questioned. It simply continued. This form of stability did not demand loyalty or commitment. People came and went. The pattern remained. No one needed to remember instructions. No one needed to enforce behavior. The order existed independently of individual intention. This allowed continuity across time without formal transmission. Only later would explanation become necessary, when repetition needed to be taught, defended, or preserved. Here, before that shift, stability did not belong to language, it belonged to rhythm. And because it was not held in words, it did not need to be protected. It remained quietly as long as it was repeated. Repetition changes character when it is no longer carried by one body alone. When the same movements are performed by many, something subtle begins to form. Not meaning, but alignment. In early human gatherings, repetition did not belong to an individual. It was not personal habit. It was shared motion. People arrived at the same place at different times. They brought different experiences, different days behind them. But once gathered, their movements began to resemble one another. They sat in similar ways. They faced the same direction. They moved closer to the same source of warmth or light. This was not instruction. No one told others how to move. The environment guided behavior quietly. Shared repetition reduced difference without erasing it. No one needed to stand out. No one needed to lead. The body adjusted naturally to what others were doing nearby. This created a sense of cohesion without agreement. There was no discussion about what the group was doing. There was no shared explanation, only shared action. When repetition becomes collective, attention shifts. It no longer needs to track individual intention. It follows group rhythm. This is important. Group repetition stabilizes awareness more deeply than solitary repetition. It confirms continuity through presence rather than explanation. The mind does not ask whether it belongs. The body already does. In such conditions, difference becomes less relevant. The same gestures are performed without comparison. The same pauses are respected without coordination. This does not create uniformity. It creates resonance. The repetition belongs to the space rather than the individual. People enter it, participate, and leave. No trace of instruction remains. No correction is needed. Because the repetition is shared, it carries weight without authority. It feels established, even without history. This is how repetition begins to feel durable, not because it has meaning, but because it is held by many bodies at once. Later, this shared repetition would be named. It would be interpreted. It would be preserved through story. Here, it remains unnamed. It is simply something that happens together, again and again. When repetition continues without explanation, it begins to shape attention itself, not by directing it forward, but by holding it in place. In early human contexts, repetition did not push experience toward a result. It kept experience where it already was. Each repeated movement reduced the need to anticipate what came next. The body already knew. The mind did not need to plan. This absence of anticipation is important. When attention does not move ahead of the moment, it remains present without effort. There is no internal countdown, no sense of after this. Repetition, in this sense, was not a technique for focus. It was a condition that made focus unnecessary. The same actions returned again and again, not quickly, not mechanically, slowly enough that awareness did not detach from sensation. The body stayed engaged just enough to prevent drifting, but not enough to create tension. This balance created a steady form of presence. Modern practices often attempt to train attention. Early repetition did not train anything. It removed the need for training. By repeating the same movement in the same place, attention had nowhere else to go. It did not need to be brought back. It never left. This kind of presence is different from concentration. It does not narrow awareness. It steadies it. There is no effort to exclude distraction. Distraction simply does not arise. The repetition itself absorbs attention gently, without demand. This is why repeated actions can feel calming, even without meaning. They do not stimulate interpretation. They do not invite judgment. They allow awareness to remain embodied. Over time, this state becomes familiar. The mind recognizes it without naming it. The body settles into it without instruction. Repetition, here, is not about doing something again. It is about staying where one already is, and in that staying, attention becomes quiet, not because it is controlled, but because it is not being pulled away. Before repetition was identified as ritual, it existed without definition. There was no word to describe it, no boundary separating ordinary action from something special. What later generations would call ritual was, at this stage, simply continuity. Actions were repeated not to invoke meaning, but to maintain balance. There was no moment when repetition crossed a threshold and became symbolic. No announcement that something had changed. The movements remained the same, the place remained the same, only time passed. Because there was no name for what was happening, there was also no obligation attached to it, no requirement to perform correctly, no fear of breaking form. Repetition remained flexible, responsive to the environment and to the people present. This absence of naming is important. Once something is named, it begins to carry expectation. It invites preservation. It invites explanation. Here, before that shift, repetition stayed light. People did not gather for a ritual. They gathered, and repetition occurred. There was no separation between daily movement and repeated movement. No division between functional action and patterned action. Everything existed on the same level. Because repetition had no label, it also had no authority. No one owned it. No one led it. It belonged to the space itself. When people entered the space, they entered the repetition. When they left, the repetition remained dormant, waiting to resume. This made repetition durable without being rigid. It did not need to be remembered consciously. It did not need to be transmitted through story or instruction. It lived in the familiarity of the place and the ease of movement. Only later would repetition be isolated, defined, and named. Only later would it be explained as ritual, belief, or practice. Here, it existed before those categories. This is a quieter state, a state where action does not point beyond itself, where repetition does not accumulate meaning, it simply continues. And in that continuation, attention remains held, not by belief, not by intention, but by the steady presence of doing the same thing in the same place once again. Most places are passed through without being noticed. They serve as background, not destination. They do not hold attention. They release it. For most of early human life, space functioned this way. Land was crossed, not regarded. Movement mattered more than location. But occasionally, a place began to behave differently. Nothing about it announced importance. There were no markers, no boundaries, no declarations. The shift was quiet. People arrived and stayed slightly longer than before. They moved less. They looked more. The place did not demand attention. Attention settled there on its own. This is the moment when a space stops being neutral. Not because it acquires meaning, but because it begins to hold focus. Neutral space allows attention to pass through it. Non-neutral space slows attention down. This slowing does not come from belief or intention. It comes from consistency. When people return to the same place repeatedly, the mind begins to recognize it before the body arrives. The environment no longer needs to be assessed. Orientation is already complete. This recognition changes perception. The eyes do not search as much. The body does not adjust as often. Movement becomes smaller, more contained. The place begins to feel steady, not because it is permanent, but because it is familiar. This familiarity creates a subtle boundary, not a physical one, but a cognitive one. Inside it, attention behaves differently. There is less scanning, less anticipation, less mental movement. The place does not need to offer resources or shelter. Its value lies in predictability. When a location remains unchanged across visits, it becomes reliable. Reliability invites stillness. This is not attachment, it is recognition. The place does not pull attention toward it. It simply does not let attention drift away as easily. Over time, this effect deepens. People begin to arrive already calm, already oriented, already quiet. Nothing is expected to happen there. Nothing needs to be completed. The place becomes a pause in movement, not an interruption, but a suspension. This is the first condition required for a space to matter. Not symbolism, not function, but the ability to hold attention without effort. Once a place reaches this point, it is no longer interchangeable with any other, even if it looks similar, even if it serves no obvious purpose. It has crossed a threshold, from background to presence, and from this point on, the space will begin to shape behavior, not by instruction, but by the way attention naturally settles within it. Before stone carried messages, Before it was shaped to represent ideas, it existed as weight and stillness. It did not explain anything. It did not point beyond itself. Stone stayed. In early human environments, defined by movement, this mattered. Bodies moved, seasons shifted, groups arrived and departed. Stone did none of this. Its presence introduced something rare, a surface that did not respond, a form that did not change. This stability had an effect on attention. When the eye rests on something that does not move, the mind slows to match it. There is no need to track, no need to anticipate. Stone does not invite interpretation, it invites pause. In spaces where stone became prominent, attention began to behave differently. People stood longer. Their movements became smaller. Their gaze returned to the same points again and again. This was not because stone held meaning. It held continuity. Against a world defined by impermanence, stone introduced contrast. It did not need to be understood to be felt. The body responded first. Breathing slowed. Posture settled. The nervous system adjusted to the absence of motion. Stone did not demand engagement. It allowed disengagement from constant adjustment. This is important. When nothing in the environment changes, the mind stops scanning for change. It rests. Stone became a stabilizing presence, not because it represented something, but because it remained the same. Even without shaping, stone affected behavior. People gathered near it. They oriented themselves around it. Its reliability created a quiet center. This center did not organize activity. It absorbed it. Movement happened around stone, not toward outcome, but toward balance. Later, stone would be carved. It would be raised, shaped, and named. But its first role was simpler. It offered stillness in a moving world. And that stillness held attention, not through instruction, not through belief, but through the simple fact of remaining where everything else passed by. In this way, stone did not communicate information. It communicated duration. It showed that something could stay. And in the presence of something that stayed, attention learned to stay as well. When attention begins to settle, orientation follows. Not through instruction, but through alignment. In spaces where people gathered repeatedly, bodies slowly began to face the same way. Not deliberately, not ceremonially, simply because the environment encouraged it. Light falls from one side. Stone holds the center. Movement becomes peripheral. When this happens, the eyes no longer wander equally in all directions. They return to the same visual field again and again. Facing the same direction reduces choice, and with fewer choices, attention softens. There is less to scan, less to compare, less to evaluate. This alignment does not require agreement. No one tells others where to look. The space itself narrows possibility. Over time, this shared orientation creates stillness. Not silence of sound, but silence of movement. The body settles because it does not need to adjust constantly. Posture becomes stable. The head remains lifted or lowered in a familiar angle. When many bodies face the same direction, awareness synchronizes subtly, not through communication, but through shared visual rhythm. This does not produce unity of thought. It produces continuity of attention. Modern environments often scatter attention by design. Screens pull the gaze in multiple directions. Movement fragments focus. Here, the opposite occurs. The space limits visual demand. The gaze returns to what is steady. Facing the same direction also removes social pressure. When no one is watching one another directly, self-awareness diminishes. The body is allowed to rest. There is no need to perform, no need to signal presence. Attention turns outward, then settles. This alignment is not symbolic. It does not point to meaning. It points to rest. Over time, facing the same direction becomes familiar. The body recognizes it without reflection. When people arrive, they naturally orient themselves, not because they were taught to, but because the space already holds that direction. This is how a place begins to guide behavior without rules, not by telling people what to do, but by quietly shaping how attention is held. In this condition, the mind stops moving ahead of the body. Thought slows to match posture. Awareness becomes stable. Facing the same direction is not about belief. It is about reducing dispersion. And when dispersion ends, attention becomes calm. Not because it is controlled, but because it has nowhere else to go. When space, posture, and repetition align, attention begins to behave differently. It no longer drifts ahead of the moment. It no longer circles back toward memory. It stays. In most environments, attention is required to move. It scans for change. It prepares for response. It remains slightly unsettled, even at rest. But in spaces that hold attention steadily, this movement slows. There is less need to check surroundings, less need to anticipate interruption. The mind stops rehearsing what comes next. This is not focus in the modern sense. There is no object being concentrated on. There is no effort to exclude distraction. Attention stops wandering because nothing invites it to. The environment does not offer multiple points of interest. It offers continuity. When nothing pulls awareness forward or sideways, the mind does not search. It does not fragment itself. Instead, attention becomes broad and still. This stillness does not feel empty. It feels contained. Thought becomes sparse, not forced away but unnecessary. The body remains present without tension. In such conditions, time is not measured. There is no internal clock marking progress. Moments do not accumulate toward an outcome. Attention remains where the body already is. This is why these spaces feel calming even to modern minds. The nervous system recognizes the absence of demand. No signal needs immediate response. No decision needs to be made. The mind is allowed to rest without disengaging. Wandering attention often creates fatigue. Not because it travels far, but because it is never allowed to stop. Here, it stops naturally. There is no sense of boredom. There is no urge to fill silence. Attention does not seek stimulation. It accepts what is present. This is not passivity. It is stability. When attention no longer wanders, awareness deepens without effort. Perception becomes clearer, not sharper. The body settles into its weight. Breathing slows. The sense of separation between self and environment softens. Nothing needs to be understood. Nothing needs to happen. This condition does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic. It simply arrives, when attention realizes it does not need to go anywhere else. A place does not become memorable the first time it is seen. It becomes memorable the first time it is returned to and recognized without effort. Before memory was recorded, it lived in familiarity, not as an image recalled, but as a sensation that preceded thought. In early human experience, remembering a place did not mean recalling details. It meant knowing how the body should move there, where to slow, where to stop. This kind of memory did not require intention. It emerged through repetition. When people arrived again at the same location, there was no need to orient from the beginning. The ground already felt known. The space already felt measured. This recognition did not happen in the mind first. It happened in the body. Steps adjusted without calculation. Posture shifted without decision. The gaze settled where it had settled before. This is the earliest form of spatial memory, not narrative, not symbolic, embodied. The place did not need to be named to be remembered. Its memory existed without language. This is important. When memory exists without words, it does not demand explanation. It does not turn into story. It remains quiet. The body remembers before the mind asks why. Returning to a remembered place creates a sense of continuity across time. Not a timeline, but a feeling of, this has happened before. That feeling reduces uncertainty. The nervous system relaxes when it recognizes environment. There is less need to assess threat, less need to prepare for change. The place becomes a point of psychological rest. Over time, this memory deepens, not through detail, but through consistency. The same angles, the same distances, the same stillness. Memory here is not something that points backward. It stabilizes the present. When people gather in a place that is remembered, attention arrives already settled. The mind does not need to warm up to the environment. This allows stillness to appear quickly. Later, memory would become something to preserve, something to tell, something to pass on. Here, it remains unspoken. The place is remembered simply because it has been experienced before, in the same way, at the same pace. This is the moment when a space becomes part of human continuity, not as meaning, but as presence. Before spaces were asked to explain themselves, they simply held what happened within them. They did not represent ideas. They did not stand for anything beyond their physical presence. In early human contexts, a place did not need to mean something in order to matter. Its role was not symbolic. It was functional in a quieter sense. The space contained movement. It contained stillness. It contained repetition. Nothing more was required. Modern thought often looks for symbolism where none was intended. It assumes that significance must be encoded, communicated, or interpreted. But here, space functioned as a container, not a message. What happened inside it did not point outward. It did not require explanation. It did not need to be translated into belief. The space simply held attention long enough for experience to stabilize. This distinction matters. A symbol directs attention beyond itself. A container allows attention to remain where it is. In spaces that acted as containers, nothing asked to be decoded. There was no visual complexity demanding interpretation, no narrative embedded in form. This allowed awareness to stay grounded. People did not enter these spaces to understand them. They entered them to remain present within them. The absence of symbolism prevented overinterpretation. It kept the mind from moving away from sensation. This is why such spaces feel calming even without meaning. They do not stimulate mental activity. They absorb it. The container does not instruct behavior. It does not prescribe action. It simply allows repetition to occur without interference. Later, when spaces began to be named, explained, and assigned meaning, this quality shifted. Containers became symbols. presence became interpretation. Here, before that shift, the space remains neutral, but not empty. It holds bodies. It holds time. It holds attention. Nothing more is asked of it, and because nothing more is asked, the mind is allowed to rest. Gathering does not always create movement. Sometimes it creates the opposite. When people come together repeatedly in the same space, activity does not increase indefinitely. It slows. At first, there is motion, arrivals, adjustments, small gestures of orientation. But once bodies settle, something quieter takes place. Movement diminishes, voices lower or disappear. Attention spreads evenly across the space. The gathering becomes still. This stillness is not imposed. No one instructs silence. No one signals that movement should stop. It happens because nothing requires response. The space holds attention steadily enough that action becomes unnecessary. There is no task to complete, no exchange to manage. People remain together without needing to interact. This condition is rare in modern life. We associate gathering with activity, conversation, exchange, performance. Stillness feels incomplete to us. Here, it was sufficient. When bodies remain close without movement, awareness synchronizes naturally. Breathing slows to a shared pace. Posture softens. There is no sense of waiting. No expectation that something should happen next. The gathering does not point toward an outcome. It exists as itself. This kind of stillness is not emptiness. It is containment. Attention remains engaged without being directed. The mind does not wander because the body does not move. In this state, individual boundaries soften, not through emotional connection, but through shared presence. No one needs to assert identity. No one needs to observe others closely. The space absorbs social pressure. Gathering becomes a way of resting together, not doing together. This is one of the earliest forms of collective calm, not achieved through agreement or belief, but through repetition and environment. The space allows people to arrive, settle, and remain, without explanation. And when gathering becomes stillness, attention stops circulating between individuals. It rests within the space itself. Up to this point, the place does not require a name. It exists through familiarity, repetition, and presence. It is recognized without being identified. But naming changes the relationship. The moment a place is named, it is pulled into language. Once in language, it becomes something that can be discussed, categorized, and separated from direct experience. Before this moment, the space does not stand apart from those who gather there. It is not about something, it is simply there. When we say Göbekli Tepe, we introduce distance. The name allows the place to travel beyond itself, into maps, texts, interpretations, and debates. It becomes something that can be visited mentally without being physically present. This is not a loss, it is a shift. Naming allows memory to be shared across time, but it also changes how attention behaves. Before naming, attention settles into the space. After naming, attention begins to move around it. Questions appear. Comparisons begin. Explanations are requested. The place becomes an object of thought. This moment marks a transition from presence to reference. What was once experienced directly becomes something that can be pointed to, described, analyzed. The space does not change, but our relationship to it does. This is why it matters that the name arrives late. Göbekli Tepe does not introduce meaning into the place. It introduces framing. Only after repetition, stillness, and shared attention are established does the name appear, not as a beginning, but as a consequence. The place was already holding attention long before it was identified. Even now, when we speak its name, the effect remains, not because of what we know about it, but because the conditions that shaped it still resonate. The stone remains still, the space remains contained, attention still slows. Naming does not erase this. It simply reminds us that what once required no explanation now invites many. And yet, beneath every explanation, the original experience remains unchanged. A place where attention settled, where movement slowed, where presence was held, long before it was called anything at all. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness, as if something has been removed, as if a space has been left unfinished. In early human environments, silence was not created by the absence of activity. It existed on its own. Sound appeared briefly, footsteps, wind, voices, and then it dissolved back into quiet. Silence did not follow sound. Sound interrupted silence. This distinction matters. When silence is the baseline, the mind does not interpret it as a loss. It does not search for something to replace it. It rests within it. In landscapes shaped by wind, stone, and open sky, silence was not rare. It was constant. There were no layered noises competing for attention, no background hum to ignore, no persistent signals demanding response. Because of this, silence did not feel artificial. It felt stable. Modern environments train the mind to associate silence with absence of information, of activity, of connection. Early environments offered the opposite lesson. Silence was where orientation happened. Without continuous sound, subtle changes became perceptible. A shift in air, a distant movement, the presence of others nearby. Silence sharpened awareness without creating tension. It did not stimulate the mind, it organized it. When sound is constant, the mind works to filter it out. This filtering requires effort, even when we are unaware of it. In silence, that effort disappears. The nervous system does not brace itself. The body does not prepare for interruption. This allows cognitive stability to emerge naturally. Silence does not remove experience. It holds it. Within silence, perception becomes more even. No single stimulus dominates. Nothing pulls attention away from presence. This is why silence can feel expansive rather than empty. It gives awareness room to settle. In spaces like Göbekli Tepe, silence would not have been imposed. There were no rules enforcing it. It emerged from environment and repetition. Stone does not echo endlessly. Open land absorbs sound. Movement slows. Silence forms as a result, not as a goal. Because silence was common, it did not carry emotional charge. It was not comforting or frightening. It was neutral. This neutrality is key. When silence is neutral, the mind does not react to it. It does not seek distraction. It does not generate noise internally to compensate. Thought becomes sparse, not because it is suppressed, but because it is unnecessary. In modern life, silence often feels uncomfortable because it exposes internal noise. In early contexts, internal noise had less opportunity to accumulate. Attention was not constantly redirected. Memory and anticipation did not overlap endlessly. Silence allowed mental processes to complete themselves without interruption. A thought could arise and end. This prevented cognitive overload. Silence also supported collective stillness. When no one speaks, no one is expected to respond. When no sound dominates, no individual dominates. The group remains present without hierarchy. This is not a social achievement. It is an environmental condition. Silence equalizes attention. It removes urgency. It removes demand. In this way, silence becomes not the absence of sound, but the presence of stability, a condition in which awareness can remain whole. Later, silence would become something to seek intentionally, something to create artificially. Here, it required no effort. It was simply how the world behaved when nothing needed to happen, and within that quiet, the mind learned how to remain, without instruction, without control, without explanation. Silence does not feel the same in every environment. It becomes unsettling only when the mind has learned to expect interruption. In early human contexts, silence was not a warning sign. It did not suggest danger or abandonment. It signaled continuity. When sound faded, nothing replaced it, and nothing needed to. This absence of replacement taught the nervous system something important. Silence did not require reaction. Modern fear of silence often comes from unpredictability. When environments are noisy by default, quiet feels like a disruption. The mind asks what has gone wrong. In early environments, silence was predictable. It followed day. It followed gathering. It followed movement. Because it was expected, it did not trigger alertness. The body did not tense in anticipation. It did not scan for threat when sound disappeared. This allowed muscles to soften, breathing to slow, posture to settle naturally. Silence became associated with safety, not because it guaranteed protection, but because it did not demand vigilance. Threat, when it appeared, was clear. It came with sound, with movement, with change. Silence meant nothing was happening. This clarity matters. When the nervous system can distinguish between danger and calm easily, it does not remain in a state of constant readiness. It conserves energy. In silence, the body recovered. This recovery did not require intention. No one tried to relax. Relaxation occurred because there was no reason not to. In group settings, this effect deepened. When many bodies remained calm in silence, reassurance spread without communication. No one needed to confirm safety verbally. The stillness itself confirmed it. Silence became a shared signal. Nothing needs to be done. Modern minds often associate silence with isolation. Early silence was rarely solitary. Even when no one spoke, others were nearby. Presence did not require sound. This prevented silence from becoming emotionally charged. There was no expectation that connection required expression. Being together was enough. When silence feels safe, attention does not search for distraction. It does not try to fill the space. Thought slows because it is no longer guarding against interruption. This creates a different internal landscape. Ideas arise less frequently. Images do not overlap. Memory and anticipation loosen their grip. The mind stops rehearsing. In such conditions, silence becomes restorative, not because it removes stimulation completely, but because it removes unnecessary stimulation. It allows the nervous system to return to baseline. This is why places shaped by silence still feel calming today. The body recognizes the condition even when the mind does not. We respond to silence not as an idea, but as a signal. When silence stops feeling unsafe, it becomes something else entirely. A space where awareness can remain open without being pulled in any direction. When silence is safe, it no longer needs to be enforced. It emerges naturally, even among many people. In early gatherings, silence was not taught. There were no signals asking for quiet, no authority guiding behavior. People simply stopped speaking. This kind of silence did not come from agreement. It came from shared conditions. The environment did not invite conversation. There was nothing to coordinate, nothing to negotiate. No task required explanation. Because of this, silence did not feel awkward or incomplete. It felt appropriate. Modern group silence often carries tension. We are trained to fill gaps, to maintain interaction, to confirm presence through sound. Early group silence carried no such pressure. Presence did not need to be demonstrated. It was assumed. When people sat together without speaking, attention did not bounce between individuals. It settled into the shared space. No one was performing. No one was being observed closely. This removed self-consciousness. The body did not need to manage expression. The face relaxed. Posture softened. Silence equalized the group. Without speech, hierarchy diminished. Without constant interaction, comparison faded. No one led the moment. No one followed. The silence belonged to the space, not to the people within it. This allowed attention to stabilize at a collective level, not synchronized through effort, but aligned through environment. Breathing slowed across the group. Movement became minimal. Awareness spread evenly. This is a cognitive state rarely experienced today. Group calm without instruction requires a world that does not demand output. Here, that condition existed. Silence was not a pause between actions. It was the action. The group remained together without doing anything together. This shared stillness created trust without communication. No one needed reassurance. The absence of urgency provided it. Because silence was common, it did not feel meaningful. It did not need to be interpreted. It simply held everyone in the same moment. This is one of the earliest examples of collective mental stability, not produced by belief, not enforced by rule, but sustained by environment and repetition. When silence requires no instruction, it becomes effortless. And when it becomes effortless, the mind stops resisting it. When silence is stable and shared, the mind begins to behave differently, not by becoming empty, but by becoming steady. In modern environments, cognitive stability is often mistaken for inactivity. If nothing is happening, the mind assumes something is missing. It searches for input. Early environments did not teach the mind to expect constant stimulation. They taught it to remain balanced without it. In places shaped by repetition and stillness, the mind did not rely on novelty to stay engaged. It did not need new information to remain oriented. Awareness stayed present because nothing disrupted it. This created a form of cognitive stability that did not depend on effort. There was no need to focus deliberately, no need to redirect wandering thoughts. Thought slowed on its own because there was nothing to accelerate it. Without stimulation, the mind did not collapse into boredom. Boredom requires expectation. Here, expectation was absent. Instead, awareness became even. Perception did not jump between ideas. Memory did not overlap with anticipation. The mind did not rehearse future actions. It did not replay past moments. It rested in the present because the present was sufficient. This is a crucial difference. Modern minds are trained to seek stimulation, to maintain coherence. Early minds maintained coherence through stability. When nothing demands attention, attention does not disappear. It becomes diffuse, wide, and calm. The nervous system does not need to filter competing inputs. It does not need to prioritize. This reduces internal noise. Cognitive energy is conserved. In such conditions, mental processes complete themselves naturally. A thought arises, lingers briefly, and fades. It does not branch endlessly into other thoughts. This prevents mental accumulation. Over time, this stability becomes familiar. The mind learns that it does not need to generate activity to remain alert. Alertness and stillness coexist. This is why silence can feel mentally restorative. It does not suppress thought. It allows thought to settle. In early contexts, this settling happened collectively and repeatedly. The mind recognized the pattern. When people returned to the same space, the same stability returned with it. The environment did the work. No practice was required. No discipline was imposed. Cognitive stability emerged as a property of the space itself. This is the condition modern people often try to recreate artificially through meditation, retreat, or ritual. Here, it was simply how attention behaved when it was not constantly redirected. Stability did not come from control. It came from absence of demand. And in that absence, the mind found balance without effort. Silence does not only shape individual awareness. When it is sustained within a group, it becomes something collective. In early gatherings, silence was not experienced privately. It was held together. This created a shared mental field, not through communication, but through the absence of it. When many bodies remain quiet in the same space, attention stops circling inward. It does not fixate on thought. It spreads outward, evenly, across the environment and the people within it. No single mind dominates this field. No single intention directs it. The silence itself becomes the organizing element. This is different from individual calm. Individual calm can be fragile. It can be disrupted by movement, sound, or proximity. Shared silence is more stable. When one body shifts, the field absorbs it. When one sound occurs, it dissolves back into quiet. No reaction is required. This creates a sense of mental containment that does not belong to any person. It belongs to the space. In such a field, awareness does not bounce between self and others. There is no need to monitor expression or response. No need to interpret social signals. The mind relaxes its boundaries. This does not mean identity disappears. It means identity is not actively maintained. People remain distinct without effort. The shared mental field allows attention to rest in between, not inside the self, not focused on others, but suspended within the space. This suspension is deeply calming. It reduces self-reference. It reduces internal narration. Thought becomes less personal, less urgent. Modern social environments rarely allow this. Group settings are filled with interaction, performance, expectation. Silence in groups often feels uncomfortable because it threatens the need to signal presence. Here, silence was presence. No one needed to speak to confirm belonging. No one needed to act to justify being there. The shared field made participation passive and complete at the same time. This is one reason these environments still feel powerful today. Even in ruins, even in absence, the spatial memory of shared silence remains. The body recognizes it before the mind understands it. Standing in such a space, modern visitors often lower their voices instinctively. They slow their movements. They pause without knowing why. This response is not cultural. It is cognitive. The space suggests a mode of awareness that does not require assertion. The shared mental field does not instruct. It invites. And because it is not owned by any individual, it does not collapse when individuals leave. It persists. This persistence allows silence to function as a form of continuity across time. Not as message, not as meaning, as condition. A condition in which minds can enter, settle, and leave without leaving a trace. This is why silence in such spaces does not feel empty. It feels held. The field remains available. Anyone who enters it adjusts automatically, not through belief, but through perception. This is the final transformation of silence in early human contexts. It stops being a sensory condition and becomes a cognitive one, a shared state in which awareness is stabilized collectively, without instruction, without explanation, without effort. And once such a field exists, it does not need to be recreated intentionally. It simply waits, held by stone, by space, by repetition, long after the voices have gone quiet. The act of covering the stones did not resemble an ending. There was no rush in it, no sign of collapse, abandonment, or fear. What happened at Göbekli Tepe was deliberate and calm. The stones were not destroyed. They were not broken or defaced. They were carefully filled in, layer by layer, with earth and debris gathered nearby. This detail matters. Urgent actions leave marks. They rush. They fracture. They abandon precision. What we see here is the opposite. The filling was gradual, intentional, almost patient. There was time taken to do this. Time not demanded by necessity. If danger had forced people away, there would be signs of haste. If catastrophe had struck, there would be disorder. Instead, there is continuity in the gesture itself. The same hands that once cleared the space return to close it. The same bodies that once gathered now performed a different repetition. This was not a reaction. It was a choice. Covering the stones did not erase the place. It softened it. The space was not sealed away violently. It was allowed to withdraw. In this sense, the action resembles neither abandonment nor preservation. It resembles conclusion without drama. There was no need to leave a visible marker. No need to signal that something important had occurred. The covering did not announce significance. It removed visibility. This suggests that what mattered was no longer meant to hold attention, not because it had failed, not because it had lost value, but because its role was complete. Modern interpretations often search for motive. Was it ritual? Was it protection? Was it concealment? These questions assume urgency, but the physical evidence suggests composure. The stones were not hidden quickly. They were not buried deep beneath chaos. They were allowed to rest beneath what had already been part of the place. This implies familiarity, not fear. The act of covering did not separate the people from the space emotionally. It did not express rejection. It expressed release. In early human contexts, not every transition required explanation. Some changes were enacted physically rather than narrated. Covering the stones may have been one such change. Not a message to future observers, not a signal of loss. A quiet decision. This focus is no longer needed. The repetition that once held attention had done its work. The space no longer needed to anchor awareness. And so, the repetition shifted. Instead of gathering around stone, the bodies gathered soil. Instead of maintaining visibility, they restored neutrality. The land returned to continuity. This is not forgetting. Forgetting erases. This preserved. By covering the stones rather than dismantling them, the place remained intact, just no longer active. The attention that once gathered there was allowed to disperse. The space stopped functioning as a container for collective stillness. It did not stop existing. This distinction is crucial. In many cultures, endings are loud. They are marked. They are remembered intentionally. Here, the ending was quiet, so quiet that it leaves modern observers uneasy. We expect significance to announce itself. We expect closure to be visible. But early human actions were not designed for interpretation. They were designed for balance. Covering the stones restored balance by removing a fixed point of attention. When attention becomes too concentrated for too long, even stillness can become heavy. The decision to cover may have been a way of lightening attention, of allowing it to move again, not because movement was superior, but because stasis had served its purpose. This act did not reject what came before. It acknowledged completion. And because there was no urgency, no violence, no spectacle, the act remains difficult to classify. Which may be the point. The stones were not buried to create mystery. They were buried to allow continuity to resume elsewhere. The place was not closed with a statement. It was closed with care. And in that care, we see something rare. A culture capable of ending a phase without needing to explain it, without needing to justify it, without needing to preserve its meaning. Just enough attention to know when to stop changing and when to let go. Ending focus is not the same as ending a place. This distinction is subtle, but essential. At Göbekli Tepe, nothing suggests that the location itself was rejected. The land remained. The hill remained. The stone remained beneath the surface. What changed was not the place, but the way attention related to it. Covering the stones did not erase the site from memory. It removed its role as a center. Before, attention gathered there repeatedly. Bodies returned. Stillness accumulated. After the covering, that concentration dissolved. This is not destruction. It is redistribution. Ending focus means releasing a fixed point of attention without severing connection entirely. The place does not disappear. It simply stops holding the same cognitive weight. Modern thinking often assumes that meaning must be preserved visibly. If something mattered, it should remain exposed. If it ends, it should be marked. Here, neither happened. The stones were not dismantled. They were not left standing as reminders. They were allowed to withdraw from visibility. This suggests that visibility itself was part of the function, and that function was no longer required. Ending focus without ending the place allows continuity without fixation. The environment remains usable. The land remains part of movement, migration, and daily rhythm. But attention is no longer pulled inward toward a single point. This prevents attachment. In early human contexts, fixation carried risk. Too much concentration in one place could disrupt movement, adaptation, and balance. Ending focus may have been a way to protect flexibility. By closing the space gently, people prevented it from becoming permanent in the wrong way. Not permanent as stone, but permanent as obligation. The act communicates restraint. Rather than allowing the place to accumulate authority, it was released from that role. This is a different relationship to place than modern societies often hold. We tend to preserve sites to keep their influence active. We mark them, maintain them, revisit them intentionally. Here, the opposite occurs. The place is allowed to rest. Attention moves on without erasing what came before. This does not imply indifference. It implies trust. Trust that continuity does not require constant reinforcement. Trust that what has been done does not need to remain visible to remain real. Ending focus without ending the place also preserves neutrality. Once attention is released, the land can return to being crossed rather than regarded. Movement resumes. The hill becomes background again. This backgrounding does not deny significance. It prevents fixation. In this way, the act of covering is not a conclusion. It is a rebalancing. The place stops being a container for collective stillness and becomes part of a wider landscape once more. No announcement is needed. No memory must be carried forward explicitly. The transition occurs physically, not symbolically. This is why modern observers struggle with it. We look for intention in explanation. They enacted intention through action alone. Ending focus without ending the place leaves no message, only a change in behavior. And yet, that change was precise. It required agreement. It required time. It required care, which suggests that releasing attention was as meaningful as gathering it once had been. Not because the place failed, but because its work was complete. The hill did not lose importance. It lost obligation. And in that loss, continuity was preserved, without fixation, without monument, without demand. Presence can be powerful, but when it remains fixed for too long, it begins to narrow movement. At Göbekli Tepe, the decision to release focus suggests a quiet preference, continuity over concentration. Presence gathers attention into one place. Continuity allows attention to move on without breaking rhythm. By covering the stones, the people involved did not abandon what had been built. They chose not to remain bound to it. This choice matters. Staying present in one place can create depth, but it can also create dependence. When a site becomes central, it begins to demand return. It accumulates expectation. Ending presence prevents this accumulation. Continuity, in contrast, does not require return. It allows patterns to persist across movement, across landscape, across time. The repetition that once occurred at the site did not disappear. It was no longer anchored there. This suggests that the function of the place had already been internalized. What was once held by stone could now be carried by bodies. The continuity did not belong to the hill. It belonged to the people. When presence is released, memory changes form. It no longer depends on location. It travels. This is a different kind of preservation. Modern preservation fixes memory to place. Early continuity allowed memory to remain active without fixation. Choosing continuity over presence also reduces hierarchy. No single place remains privileged. No location becomes mandatory. Movement regains its importance. Groups could gather elsewhere, repeat elsewhere. becomes still elsewhere. The stability once provided by stone did not vanish. It redistributed. This redistribution is subtle but profound. It suggests confidence in pattern rather than structure, trust in rhythm rather than monument. Continuity does not require permanence. It requires repetition that can move. By releasing presence, the people involved prevented the place from becoming a destination that defined them. Instead, the place became one phase among many. This allowed adaptation. As environments changed, as groups shifted, the absence of a fixed center reduced resistance. Continuity is resilient because it is not attached to a single form. Presence, by contrast, is vulnerable to loss. By choosing continuity, they avoided the risk of collapse associated with fixed focus. The stones remained, but their role changed. They were no longer participants. They became background. And in becoming background, they preserved balance. This choice does not reflect uncertainty. It reflects completion. The repetition had done what it needed to do. The stillness had stabilized awareness. There was no need to keep returning. Continuity could now proceed without a center. This is not a retreat from meaning. It is a refusal to concentrate meaning in one place. In doing so, the people involved allowed their practices to remain flexible, responsive, and alive. Continuity was not preserved by staying. It was preserved by moving on. And that movement did not erase what came before. It carried it, quietly, into what came next. In modern thinking, time is assumed to be continuous and open-ended. It moves forward without pause, without boundary. Periods blur into one another unless they are marked deliberately. At Göbekli Tepe, the act of covering suggests a different understanding. Time was not only something that passed, it was something that could be completed. Closing time does not mean stopping it. It means allowing a phase to finish without carrying it forward unnecessarily. The structures at Göbekli Tepe were not abandoned mid-use. They were not left incomplete. They were closed. This closure did not require ceremony or explanation. It was enacted physically. By covering the stones, the people involved created a boundary in time, not through dates or memory, but through action. What had happened there belonged to a finished interval. Modern cultures often keep phases open indefinitely. We revisit, reinterpret, preserve, and extend meaning long after a function has ended. Here, the opposite occurs. The past is allowed to rest. Closing time in this way prevents accumulation. Meaning does not pile up. Attention does not linger beyond necessity. This creates lightness. When a phase is closed, it does not demand return. It does not ask to be maintained. The energy once directed toward it becomes available again. This does not imply forgetfulness. It implies restraint. The act of closure signals confidence that what was needed has already occurred. There is no anxiety about loss, no attempt to secure permanence. Time is trusted to move on. This suggests a relationship with time that is neither anxious nor possessive. Instead of holding on to moments, they are released. Closing time also protects continuity. When phases remain open, they compete with the present. They draw attention backward. By closing a phase cleanly, attention is freed to engage elsewhere. The future does not need to negotiate with the past. This kind of closure is rare today. We often confuse preservation with respect. At Göbekli Tepe, respect may have taken a different form, knowing when to stop. Time did not need to be explained. It needed to be concluded. The stones were not reminders. They were markers of completion, not visible ones, but functional ones. Once covered, they no longer pulled attention. They no longer participated in the present. This allowed time to remain layered, but not congested. Each phase could exist without intruding on the next. Closing time is not an ending. It is a release. It allows continuity to move forward without dragging weight behind it. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe demonstrates a quiet mastery of temporal balance. Not everything needs to remain open. Not every moment needs to be carried. Some phases are meant to finish, and when they do, the most respectful action may be to let them rest, without explanation, without display, without demand. There are moments when attention has completed its task, not because something failed, but because something has settled. The phrase, "we no longer need this focus," does not imply rejection. It implies sufficiency. At Göbekli Tepe, the release of attention appears calm, measured, and deliberate. Nothing suggests loss of control. Nothing suggests urgency. The focus that once gathered around stone, repetition, and stillness had done its work. Attention had been held long enough to stabilize something deeper. Not belief, not doctrine, but orientation. Once orientation is internalized, it no longer needs an external anchor. This is the quiet logic behind release. Modern cultures often cling to focus even after it has served its purpose. We keep returning, reinterpreting, reinforcing. Early human contexts appear to have operated differently. When focus was no longer required, it was allowed to dissolve. This dissolution was not chaotic. It was guided by restraint. The stones were not dismantled. They were not left standing as monuments. They were simply removed from view. Visibility ended. Influence softened. This suggests that focus itself was understood as a temporary state, something to be entered and exited, not something to be preserved indefinitely. Ending focus did not mean ending continuity. The repetition that once centered on the stones could continue elsewhere. The stillness did not belong to the place. It belonged to the pattern. By releasing the place, the pattern was freed to move. This reflects confidence. Confidence that meaning does not require constant reinforcement. Confidence that what has been learned does not need to be displayed. In this way, "we no longer need this focus" becomes a statement of completion, not spoken, not recorded, enacted. The act of covering the stones was not an attempt to hide knowledge from the future. It was an act of closure for the present. Attention moved on because it was ready to. This readiness is difficult for modern minds to accept. We often assume that value must be defended. Here, value was trusted. The focus ended because it was no longer necessary. Not because it was wrong, not because it was dangerous, because it had fulfilled its role. This understanding reframes Göbekli Tepe entirely. It is not a mystery site waiting to be solved. It is a completed phase waiting to be respected. The calm with which attention was released mirrors the calm with which it was once gathered. There is symmetry here. Gathering without urgency, releasing without drama. The stones did not demand remembrance. They allowed departure. And in that allowance, they demonstrate something rare, an understanding that attention, like time, is not meant to be held forever. Some focuses exist to be entered deeply and then left behind, not forgotten, completed. There is a quiet familiarity that arises when the modern mind encounters places like Göbekli Tepe. Not recognition in the sense of memory, but recognition in the sense of the body knowing something before the mind can explain it. Most people who look at Göbekli Tepe do not understand what they are seeing. There is no clear narrative, no obvious function, no instruction on how to interpret the space. And yet, something softens. The shoulders lower slightly, breathing slows without effort. Attention gathers, but without tension. This response is not cultural, it is physiological. The modern mind is trained to associate focus with effort. To pay attention means to concentrate, to analyze, to extract meaning. Focus is linked to productivity, judgment, and outcome. But Göbekli Tepe invites a different kind of attention. An attention without task. Here, there is nothing to solve, nothing to master, nothing to optimize. The stones do not demand interpretation. They do not compete for relevance. They simply remain. This absence of demand is what the nervous system responds to. When attention is no longer pulled in multiple directions, the body enters a state of regulation. Heart rate variability increases. Muscle tension decreases. The brain shifts away from threat monitoring. The mind may still ask questions, but the body has already decided that it is safe to rest. This is why many people report feeling calm rather than curious, settled rather than stimulated. The calm does not come from understanding the past. It comes from encountering a form of attention that predates modern distraction. Before language dominated experience, attention was shaped by environment rather than instruction. The eye followed stone, shadow, and repetition. The body learned when to remain still. This type of attention required no effort. It emerged naturally in spaces that did not overwhelm the senses. Göbekli Tepe reflects this sensory economy. There are no colors demanding preference, no symbols competing for meaning, no hierarchy of importance. Everything is present and nothing insists. The modern mind, though overstimulated, has not forgotten this state. It remembers what it feels like when attention is allowed to settle without direction. This is why the calm arrives before explanation. Even when visitors attempt to analyze, the analysis often feels secondary. The primary experience is one of quiet alignment. This alignment mirrors the early stages of sleep, not the loss of consciousness, but the moment when vigilance loosens. The body begins to trust that nothing urgent is required. In this way, Göbekli Tepe does not communicate through symbols. It communicates through absence, absence of urgency, absence of noise, absence of demand. And the modern mind, despite centuries of conditioning, still knows how to respond. It recognizes the state, not as something new, but as something remembered. When attention no longer has to defend itself, rest becomes possible. And that recognition is not learned, it is recalled. Silence is no longer a natural condition for the modern mind. It has become unfamiliar and, for many, uncomfortable. This discomfort is often mistaken for restlessness or boredom, but it is neither. It is the nervous system reacting to the absence of stimulation it has been trained to expect. In the modern world, attention is rarely left unoccupied. Sound fills space automatically. Visual input arrives without pause. Information replaces emptiness the moment it appears. Silence, once common, now feels like a gap that must be filled. But historically, silence was not an interruption. It was the background state of life. Before engines, before constant speech, before artificial light, long stretches of quiet were ordinary. Night, especially, brought a deep reduction in sensory input. This reduction did not signal danger by default. It signaled pause. The body learned to downshift with the environment. Göbekli Tepe reflects a world where silence was not rare enough to be threatening. There were no alarms embedded in quiet. No expectation that something must happen next. Silence allowed attention to soften rather than brace itself. In contrast, modern silence often triggers vigilance. When sound stops, the mind scans. When notifications pause, anticipation rises. The absence of input is interpreted as uncertainty. This is not because silence is harmful. It is because it has become unfamiliar. The nervous system adapts to patterns, not ideals. When stimulation becomes constant, calm feels unsafe. Göbekli Tepe offers a different pattern. There is no auditory command, no visual hierarchy, no signal instructing the mind where to go next. The environment does not direct attention outward. As a result, attention turns inward, gently, without intention. This inward movement is not introspection, it is regulation. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is stability. A stable sensory field allows the brain to reduce prediction and control. Nothing needs to be anticipated. Nothing needs to be defended against. This is why silence feels restorative here, rather than awkward. The modern mind misses silence not because it wants less stimulation, but because it longs for a state where stimulation is no longer required. A state where attention can exist without assignment. Göbekli Tepe does not recreate silence artificially. It reveals what silence once was. Not an absence of life, but a condition that allowed life to slow. This slowing mirrors the transition into sleep. As sound diminishes, the mind releases vigilance. As visual demand softens, thought loosens its grip. The calm felt in the presence of ancient silence is not nostalgia, it is recognition. Recognition of a state the body still knows how to enter, even if it rarely gets the chance. This is why silence, though unfamiliar, feels deeply missed. Not consciously, but physically. In the modern world, focus is rarely neutral. It is almost always assigned a purpose. To focus is to achieve, to complete, to improve. Attention is treated as a tool, something to be directed, managed, and measured. Because of this, focus often carries tension. The body associates attention with effort, and effort with demand. But focus has not always functioned this way. In earlier human contexts, attention was not a means to an outcome. It was a state of presence. Göbekli Tepe reflects this older relationship with focus. There is nothing in the space that suggests productivity, no indication of efficiency or progress. Attention gathers, but it does not move forward. It remains. This form of focus does not aim toward resolution. It does not seek completion. And because nothing is expected of it, the body experiences it as rest. Rest, in this sense, is not inactivity. It is the absence of demand. When focus is free of purpose, the nervous system stops preparing for action. Muscles soften, breathing deepens. The mind does not disengage, it stabilizes. This stability resembles the state just before sleep. Not unconsciousness, but the moment when the mind no longer needs to hold itself alert. Modern people often describe this as spacing out or zoning out, but these terms imply loss. What actually occurs is containment. Attention is held, but gently. Göbekli Tepe encourages this containment naturally. There is no instruction to look harder or think deeper. The environment does not reward effort. Nothing changes if you try to understand more. This removes the pressure to perform attention correctly. As a result, focus becomes spacious. It no longer narrows, it widens. This widening allows thought to slow without resistance. Modern minds rarely experience focus without goal. When it happens, it often feels unfamiliar at first. But the body responds quickly. The tension associated with doing focus fades, and attention becomes something that can be rested inside. This is why places like Göbekli Tepe feel calming even without explanation. The calm does not come from learning something new. It comes from remembering a mode of attention that predates instruction. A mode where focus was not a task, but a condition. When focus does not demand output, it becomes indistinguishable from rest. This is the quiet paradox at the center of Göbekli Tepe's effect. Attention does not tire the mind here, it relieves it. Long before the mind begins to interpret, the body has already responded. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of human perception. We often assume understanding comes first, that the mind analyzes and the body follows. But in reality, the sequence is often reversed. At Göbekli Tepe, this reversal becomes clear. People frequently report a sense of calm without being able to explain why. They feel settled before they feel informed, grounded before they feel curious. This is not a failure of comprehension. It is a biological response. The human nervous system is designed to assess safety before meaning. Before symbols are decoded, the body evaluates rhythm, scale, repetition, and stillness. Göbekli Tepe communicates primarily through these channels. The stones do not move. The space does not rush. Nothing demands immediate reaction. This allows the body to downshift automatically. Heart rate slows. Breathing deepens. Muscle tone softens. These changes occur without conscious effort. The mind may still ask questions, but the body has already decided that vigilance is unnecessary. This is why explanation often feels secondary in this environment. Understanding is optional. Regulation is immediate. Modern environments rarely allow this sequence to unfold naturally. Most spaces require interpretation before relaxation. Signs must be read, rules must be followed, outcomes must be anticipated. As a result, the body remains alert even when the mind wants to rest. Göbekli Tepe removes these requirements. There is no instruction to follow, no role to perform, no correct way to engage. The body recognizes this freedom instantly. It responds to the absence of demand. This response mirrors the early stages of sleep. Not the loss of awareness, but the moment when the body begins to trust that it can let go. Thoughts may still pass through the mind, but they no longer need to be managed. They slow naturally. This is why many people feel calm even while thinking. The body has taken the lead. When the body is regulated, the mind no longer needs to control. This relationship between body and environment is ancient. Before abstract reasoning dominated experience, humans relied on bodily cues to determine when to remain alert and when to rest. Spaces that offered stability allowed the nervous system to recover. Göbekli Tepe functions as such a space, not because it was designed for relaxation, but because it does not disrupt the body's natural rhythms. The body recognizes stillness as permission. Permission to stop scanning, permission to stop preparing. In this way, Göbekli Tepe calms not by explaining, but by allowing the body to arrive before the mind. And when the body arrives first, rest follows more easily. The modern mind approaches the world with a quiet expectation. Everything should make sense. We are trained to look for explanations, causes, and conclusions. Meaning is something to be uncovered, clarified, and finalized. When a place resists this process, it feels difficult. Göbekli Tepe is often described as challenging for this reason, not because it is confusing, but because it does not offer resolution. There is no clear story to complete, no definitive purpose to confirm, and yet the place does not feel incomplete. This reveals an important difference between meaning and closure. Modern understanding seeks closure. Ancient contexts often sought balance. Göbekli Tepe does not demand interpretation. It does not reward analysis. The stones remain silent regardless of the questions asked. This silence is not ignorance. It is restraint. Some places were not created to be understood in full. They were created to be experienced, and then left undisturbed. This idea challenges modern habits of thought. We assume that knowledge must be extracted. That value increases with explanation. But Göbekli Tepe suggests another possibility. That presence itself was once enough. The absence of explanation does not create anxiety here. It creates space. Space for attention to settle. Space for the body to regulate. Space for the mind to release its need to finish. This is why Göbekli Tepe remains calming rather than frustrating. It does not confront the viewer with missing information. It offers a condition where the demand to know is gently suspended. In sleep, something similar occurs. The mind releases its insistence on clarity. Thoughts lose their edges. Questions no longer require answers. Göbekli Tepe evokes this state without effort, not by guiding interpretation, but by removing the need for it. In this way, the site becomes a mirror for the modern mind. It reveals how rarely we allow ourselves to rest without understanding, how unfamiliar it feels to let something remain unresolved, and how deeply relieving that experience can be. Göbekli Tepe does not ask to be solved. It asks to be approached without urgency, to be acknowledged without conclusion. Some places were built to hold attention, and then release it. They do not exist to explain the past. They exist to remind us that not everything needs to be known in order to be at peace. There are places that do not stay with us because we understand them, but because they changed the way our attention moved while we were there. Göbekli Tepe is one of those places. It does not offer answers to carry away. It offers a state to pass through. A moment where attention was allowed to gather without effort and release without loss. Nothing here asked to be remembered precisely. Nothing insisted on explanation. The stones did not speak, yet they did not need to. What remained was not information, but alignment. The kind that settles quietly in the body and does not ask to be held. Long after we leave, the calm persists, not as memory, but as recognition. Recognition of a way of being where attention did not have to defend itself, where focus did not demand purpose, where silence did not feel empty. Göbekli Tepe does not wait for understanding. It waits for stillness. And when attention slows enough, that stillness becomes familiar. Not because it is ancient, but because it is human. Some places were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be visited, and then left gently behind. As the night continues, there is nothing more to take with you, no conclusion to hold, no meaning to secure, only the quiet knowledge that attention, when allowed to rest, knows how to let go.